The 1940s looked tough. Big steel bodies, roaring engines, and classic style. But most cars from that decade were deadly. Built with war-era parts and old designs, they had no safety, weak brakes, and steering that could kill you in a crash. These machines weren't made to protect, they were made to survive production. Here are the 9 worst cars of the 1940s that proved driving back then was a dangerous gamble. The 1940-1948 Ford Deluxe was more than just a car. It was an emblem of pre-war optimism, wartime endurance, and post-war rebirth. Its sweeping fenders, chrome-laden grille, and elegant proportions made it one of the most recognizable American cars of its time. It represented prosperity returning to ordinary people after the Depression, and then again after the war, when families wanted something stylish but affordable. It was the car that carried soldiers home, the car that appeared in countless family photos, the car that symbolized freedom on the open road. Yet behind that shining promise of American progress, the Ford Deluxe concealed an ugly secret. It was one of the most unforgiving and dangerous vehicles ever put on the road. When it debuted in 1940, the Ford Deluxe was considered a modern marvel. Its 221 cubic inch flathead V8 engine was smooth, reliable, and full of torque. It gave the car a feeling of effortless power compared to its 6-cylinder competitors. It could cruise at 70 miles per hour with ease, and its solid steel construction made owners believe it was built to last forever. But this illusion of strength was deadly. The body's rigidity, combined with the total absence of structural crumple zones, meant that in any serious impact, the force of a collision was transferred directly to the occupants. The interior was a chamber of solid metal, no padding, no plastic, no safety considerations whatsoever. The dashboard was pressed steel, thick and unyielding, with hard knobs, levers, and even sharp decorative edges that could turn into lethal shrapnel in a crash. The steering column, a simple straight rod attached to the front wheels, pointed directly toward the driver's chest. In those days, steering wheels didn't collapse or deflect, they impaled. Accident reports from the 1940s and early 1950s describe horrifying injuries caused by the column punching straight through the rib cage. Safety belts were non-existent. The concept of energy absorption or controlled deformation in a vehicle was still a distant dream. Engineers simply built things strong, and strength was mistaken for safety. The brakes of the Ford Deluxe were mechanical or early hydraulic drums, notorious for fading under heat. Long descents through hilly terrain would cause the linings to overheat and glaze, leaving drivers with almost no stopping power. A 1947 owner from Pennsylvania once said, "You learned to drive it with fear. If you went down a mountain too fast, you either lost your brakes or your courage first." Drivers were taught to use engine braking, downshifting early, and keeping a wide distance from cars ahead, techniques born from necessity, not design. Then there was the glass. The early models used plate glass for the windshield and windows, which shattered into long, razor-edged shards during a crash. Many people lost eyes or suffered deep lacerations in even minor collisions. The first laminated safety glass began appearing during the war years, but wasn't consistently used in all production runs until after 1946. In those transitional years, many cars were built with whatever glass suppliers could deliver, meaning safety was more a matter of luck than engineering. Door latches were primitive and unreliable. They often failed under impact, throwing occupants from the car. Reports from police departments in the late 1940s document numerous fatal ejections caused by doors popping open during rollovers or frontal impacts. "When you hit something, the doors flew open like a saloon in a Western," recalled a retired officer who drove a 41 Deluxe patrol car. Without seatbelts, a collision at 40 miles per hour could send everyone tumbling onto the pavement, or worse, into oncoming traffic. Another overlooked danger came from the car's suspension and steering geometry. The Deluxe's front suspension used transverse leaf springs, a design carried over from the 1930s, which made the car extremely sensitive to road imperfections. Combine that with narrow bias-ply tires, vague steering response, and poor weight distribution, and the result was a car that could fishtail or plow uncontrollably when pushed too hard. In wet or icy conditions, the Deluxe became a rolling hazard. The heavy front end caused understeer, while sudden braking could send the rear wheels sliding out, a deadly combination on narrow rural roads. Yet despite these flaws, the Ford Deluxe was adored. It was reliable, easy to service, and it had that undefinable Ford charm, simple, honest, and distinctly American. Soldiers returning from World War II often bought used 1940 models because new cars were scarce until production resumed in late 1945. They modified them, painted them wild colors, lowered the suspensions, and turned them into the first generation of hot rods. The car became a symbol of youth and rebellion, a rolling embodiment of post-war freedom. Few of those young men realized that beneath their gleaming hoods lurked one of the most dangerous designs ever made. By the 1950s, safety researchers like Hugh DeHaven and later Ralph Nader began studying the structural hazards of older vehicles. The Ford Deluxe often appeared in crash analyses as a textbook example of lethal pre-safety design. In controlled tests, low-speed impacts showed the steering column and dash delivering fatal forces even at 30 miles per hour. Photographs from these studies reveal interiors twisted, dashboards bent inward, and steering wheels crushed into the driver's seat. It was a grim revelation. The beloved Ford that symbolized America's strength was in fact a relic of dangerous ignorance about human survival in crashes. Today, surviving Ford Deluxe models are cherished for their Art Deco beauty and craftsmanship. Restorers polish their chrome grills, rebuild their flathead V8s, and parade them proudly at car shows. But among safety historians, the car stands as a haunting reminder of an era when cars were built like fortresses, but protected like coffins. The Deluxe tells the story of how far automobile safety has come and how little drivers once knew about the silent risks behind the wheel. In the 1940s, stepping into a Ford Deluxe meant stepping into a time when driving was an act of trust. Trust in steel, in mechanics, in one's own skill, and in fate. It was a car that carried America through one of its most turbulent decades, a beautiful killer wrapped in chrome and confidence. It embodied the belief that strength meant safety, when in truth, it was the opposite. The Ford Deluxe didn't just take Americans down the road, it helped them teach them, tragically, how deadly that road could be.
The 1941 to 1948 Chevrolet Fleetline is often remembered as one of the most elegant and fluid designs of its era, with its long, sweeping fenders and rounded fastback roofline that hinted at the streamlined future of American automobiles. It was a car that carried a new visual language, one that traded the boxy look of the 1930s for something that seemed to glide, even when standing still. For many Americans, especially after the war, the Fleetline represented progress, modernity, and the idea that better days were finally ahead. It was a car seen in parades, on honeymoon trips, and outside small-town diners. Yet beneath that graceful exterior was a dangerous truth. The Fleetline, like most cars of its generation, was a rolling death trap in a crash. It combined a heavy, rigid structure with primitive safety engineering that turned accidents into near-certain disasters. Chevrolet built the Fleetline on a strong ladder-frame chassis, a feature that gave it a reputation for toughness, but in reality, it was exactly that rigidity that made it deadly. The concept of a crumple zone simply did not exist. The front of the car was designed to resist damage, not absorb it, which meant that in a collision, the energy of impact went straight through the steel frame into the cabin. The steering column, a solid steel shaft directly connected to the steering box, was positioned perfectly to impale the driver in a frontal crash. There were no collapsible joints or energy-dissipating mechanisms. The wheel itself was large and stiff, designed more for leverage than for safety. One 1947 accident report described a driver who died instantly when the steering shaft entered his chest cavity upon impact at approximately 35 miles per hour. That wasn't unusual. It was simply how these cars behaved when something went wrong. The Fleetline's interior, like most cars of its day, was an exercise in deadly beauty. Its dashboard was a solid sheet of stamped steel decorated with bright chrome knobs and horizontal trim bars. In the event of a crash, those beautiful chrome details became sharp projectiles. The glove compartment door could swing open violently, slicing into passengers, and the radio, an optional luxury for the time, was heavy enough to break bones if torn loose. Even the large steering wheel hub, which appeared padded, was just hard Bakelite over steel. There was no give, no cushioning, and no restraint system whatsoever. Seatbelts were not even offered as an option. They were considered unnecessary, even suspicious by most buyers. The brakes on the Fleetline were another major weak point. Chevrolet equipped it with hydraulic drum brakes on all four wheels, but they were notoriously prone to fade when hot. The car's heavy body, over 3,200 pounds in some trims, meant that stopping distances were long and unpredictable. Period road tests from Popular Mechanics and Mechanics Illustrated noted that repeated stops from 50 miles per hour caused dramatic loss of pedal response and visible smoke from the drums. On long descents, especially in the western states where mountain driving was common, many Fleetline owners learned to downshift aggressively just to survive the trip. One retired driver from Colorado recalled, "If you didn't use the gears, you'd burn the brakes to the drums by the second hill. It felt like steering a battleship with bicycle brakes." Chevrolet's pre-war and immediate post-war engineering also suffered from uneven quality due to wartime production priorities. During World War II, civilian car production halted, and when it resumed in late 1945, the Fleetline was essentially a reissued 1942 model with minor cosmetic updates. Materials were scarce, assembly lines were being retooled, and workers were adjusting to peacetime production again. As a result, welds were inconsistent, door latches were weak, and many cars rolled off the line with minor alignment issues. Those weak door mechanisms became deadly in accidents, as they had a tendency to burst open on impact, ejecting passengers onto the road. Survivors often described being thrown like laundry in rollovers or side collisions. Visibility was another silent hazard. The stylish, low-slung design that made the Fleetline look sleek also created massive blind spots, especially with its narrow rear window and thick rear pillars. In the days before turn signals became standard, drivers relied on hand signals, but the Fleetline's curving rear fenders made it difficult for following drivers to see those gestures, leading to countless rear-end collisions. At night, the car's small taillights offered little warning to vehicles approaching from behind at higher speeds, a deadly problem on the dark highways of the 1940s. Mechanically, the Fleetline was reliable, powered by Chevrolet's trusty 216 cubic inch stove-bolt inline-six, an engine famous for its durability, but not for its performance. Top speed hovered around 80 miles per hour, which was fast enough to be fatal on the primitive two-lane highways of the time. Steering was slow, heavy, and imprecise, with multiple inches of play in the wheel, making emergency maneuvers nearly impossible. Combined with narrow bias-ply tires and primitive suspension geometry, the Fleetline could easily skid out of control if a driver braked or turned too suddenly. When that back end let go, you were just along for the ride, remembered one owner from Illinois who wrecked his 1946 model in a rainstorm. You didn't steer it, it steered you. Despite these dangers, the Fleetline remained a beloved car. It looked modern and sophisticated, and it carried Chevrolet's reputation for affordability and dependability. It became a family heirloom for many, a car that survived through weddings, road trips, and long post-war journeys on Route 66. For young men returning from war, it was a symbol of freedom. For working families, it was proof that America was moving forward again. But its beauty hid its brutality. The Fleetline, like most cars of the 1940s, was built for style and durability, not safety or forgiveness. Its very design, thick steel, rigid frame, heavy weight, made it deadly when things went wrong. Today, the Chevrolet Fleetline is a prized collector's item, celebrated for its graceful fastback styling and the way it captures the spirit of post-war America. Restored models gleam under show lights, evoking nostalgia for a simpler time. But those who know the history see something more complex, a car that reflects both the optimism and the ignorance of its age. It was born in a time when people equated mass with safety, when chrome was beauty, and when the idea of surviving a crash was almost never discussed. The Fleetline's rounded body may have looked smooth and safe, but its soul was forged in an era when the only real safety feature was luck.
The 1940 to 1950 Plymouth Special Deluxe was one of the defining American family cars of its generation. The sort of vehicle that carried servicemen home from the war, took families on their first long road trips, and filled suburban driveways in the years when optimism was rebuilding the nation. It was a car that looked dependable, sturdy, and wholesome, with its rounded fenders, proud grille, and no-nonsense Chrysler engineering. For millions of Americans, the Special Deluxe represented reliability in uncertain times. But beneath that friendly exterior was a dangerously outdated machine, a car that, like most of its era, turned every collision into a deadly gamble. Plymouth's reputation in the 1940s was built on honesty and value. The Special Deluxe was the brand's top trim line, a step above the basic models, offering more chrome, a smoother ride, and a touch of style for the working class. It came equipped with a 201 cubic inch flathead six-cylinder engine producing around 84 horsepower. Modest by later standards, but more than enough for the slower roads of its day. Owners praised its smooth idle, simple mechanics, and solid feel. But that very solidity was deceptive, because in a crash, its all-steel construction was as unforgiving as an iron cage. Inside, everything the driver or passenger could touch was metal, from the sharp-edged dashboard to the chrome knobs and the steel steering wheel rim. The dashboard, wide and gleaming, looked luxurious, but was effectively a wall of metal aimed straight at your face. There were no seat belts, no padded surfaces, and no collapsible steering column. In frontal impacts, the steering shaft had a grim tendency to spear the driver's chest, a common fatality pattern in these cars. Newspaper reports from the late 1940s and early 1950s are filled with accounts of drivers dying instantly from chest injuries in low-speed collisions that would be survivable today. The Plymouth Special Deluxe was built on a traditional body-on-frame chassis that emphasized rigidity and durability, which was ideal for rough American roads, but catastrophic in an accident. The front end had no deformation zones. The engine block itself acted like a solid battering ram. In crashes, the frame transferred the impact directly to the passenger compartment, sometimes shearing the floor pan or firewall. Safety engineers of later decades would use these cars as examples of why strength was not the same as safety. The front suspension of the Plymouth was notoriously primitive. It used a combination of leaf springs and unequal-length control arms that offered a comfortable ride on smooth pavement but performed poorly on rough terrain. On uneven or broken roads, the geometry could shift under load, and the wheel hubs were known to collapse if struck hard by a pothole or curb. Country drivers and mechanics often carried spare front-end parts because they knew a bad hit could cripple the car. An Ohio farmer who owned a 1947 Special Deluxe once said, "If you hit a rut too fast, the wheel didn't just bend, it folded like paper." This design flaw made the car treacherous on America's expanding network of highways, where higher speeds and inconsistent road conditions exposed its weaknesses. The braking system, too, was barely adequate. The Plymouth used hydraulic drum brakes on all four wheels, but they required considerable pedal pressure and had a tendency to fade with heat or moisture. After a few hard stops, they became soft and unpredictable, forcing drivers to anticipate every slowdown well in advance. Mechanics often advised drivers to pump the brakes before an intersection to build pressure, a habit that sometimes delayed stopping when it mattered most. On long descents, the drums would heat up so badly that the brake pedal could sink almost to the floor. A retired police officer from California who drove a fleet of 1948 Plymouths for duty recalled, "You could smell them burning halfway down the hill. Once that happened, you just prayed the light stayed green." Visibility and handling were equally poor by modern standards. The steering was slow, with enormous play in the wheel, and the heavy front end gave the car a lumbering, uncertain feel at higher speeds. The suspension was soft, which made the ride comfortable on smooth roads, but caused severe body roll in corners. When combined with bias-ply tires and narrow track width, it made sudden maneuvers nearly impossible. Drivers who swerved to avoid obstacles often found themselves fishtailing or rolling the vehicle. Crash records from the late 1940s readingly describe single-car accidents in which the driver lost control on a curve, a polite way of saying that the Plymouth's design didn't allow recovery once it started to slide. And like most American cars of the time, the Plymouth had fragile door latches that often flew open during a collision, ejecting passengers. The windshield glass, especially in early pre-war and immediate post-war models, was not consistently laminated, meaning it could shatter into long razor-edge shards that tore through the cabin. Survivors of crashes spoke of the glass turning into knives as it exploded inward. One gruesome account from a 1949 Missouri accident described the driver suffering dozens of deep facial cuts after the windshield disintegrated in one piece. And yet, the Plymouth Special Deluxe was beloved. It was a car built for ordinary Americans, simple, affordable, and rugged enough to endure daily use. Soldiers returning from war bought them in droves, and young families saw them as a symbol of stability. It was often the first new car a post-war family owned, the vehicle that carried children to school and parents to work. Many owners spoke fondly of its reliability. It started every morning, even in cold weather, and it was easy to repair. One old mechanic liked to say, you could fix it with a wrench and a prayer. But those virtues couldn't save it from the realities of physics. By the late 1950s, as safety research began to evolve, the Plymouth Special Deluxe became a textbook example of pre-safety era design. Test dummies showed how its solid steering column and stiff frame delivered catastrophic forces to the driver. Even at speeds as low as 25 miles per hour, test dummies suffered what modern researchers call non-survivable intrusion. The very qualities owners admired, its heavy steel body, its solid ride, its simple mechanics, were the same traits that made it lethal in an impact. Today, collectors view the Special Deluxe with a kind of reverence. Its bulbous fenders, elegant chrome trim, and classic proportions evoke a sense of Americana that no modern car can match. At shows, gleaming restorations often sit beneath American flags, their polished hoods reflecting a time when cars were more art than science. But behind that nostalgia lies a darker truth, that this family favorite was as much a hazard as it was a companion. It was built in an era when drivers trusted luck more than engineering, when style and strength mattered more than survival, and when the open road was as much a risk as it was a dream. The Plymouth Special Deluxe was, in every sense, a symbol of its time, a proud, loyal, deadly machine. It carried America through war, peace, and the dawn of modern motoring, but it did so without mercy. It stood for freedom, but demanded caution. It represented progress, but concealed danger. And like many cars of the 1940s, it reminds us that the golden age of motoring was beautiful to behold, but perilous to live through.
The 1941-1949 Hudson Commodore was one of the most advanced and luxurious American cars of its era, a bold, low-slung machine that looked more like a modern post-war cruiser than a relic of the 1930s. Hudson Motor Car Company, based in Detroit, but operating in its own fiercely independent orbit, was known for innovation. Long before the Big Three began experimenting with unitized body structures and aerodynamic shapes, Hudson was already pushing boundaries in design, performance, and comfort. The Commodore represented the pinnacle of that ambition, elegant, substantial, and impeccably crafted. Yet for all its refinement and forward thinking, it was also a deadly machine in a crash, the sort of car that demonstrated just how far style and engineering could outpace safety awareness. The Hudson Commodore's defining characteristic was its weight. Fully loaded, the car could tip the scales at nearly 3,900 pounds, astonishing for the time. It was marketed as solid, stable, and safe-feeling, which appealed to drivers who equated mass with protection. In truth, that weight was both its glory and its curse. When a car of such size and rigidity met another vehicle or a stationary object, the forces unleashed were catastrophic. There were no crumple zones, no deformable materials, and certainly no seatbelts to restrain the occupants. Every ounce of momentum the Commodore carried was transmitted directly through the chassis into the cabin.
turning passengers into projectiles inside a steel shell. Hudson prided itself on its engineering, and the Commodore was indeed an impressive piece of machinery. Its chassis used a mono-built semi-unitized structure, a design introduced by Hudson engineers in the late 1930s that lowered the floor pan and improved rigidity. This gave the car its distinctive step-down profile, where passengers sat lower between the frame rails rather than on top of them. It made the ride feel stable and planted, but it also made the structure exceptionally stiff. In an impact, there was almost no give. The entire cabin acted as a single rigid unit, magnifying the violence of a crash. It was, in effect, an iron cocoon with no escape routes. Passengers who experienced frontal collisions often suffered massive internal injuries, even when the exterior of the car appeared relatively undamaged. A haunting reminder that a car can look safe and yet be lethal. Inside, the Hudson Commodore was a study in pre-war luxury. Broad, softly curved seats, upholstered in plush fabric, gleaming chrome accents, and an elegantly sculpted dashboard. But the comfort stopped at the surface. That beautiful dashboard was solid metal, and the steering column extended straight toward the driver's chest like a lance. The steering wheel itself, wide and hard, offered no energy absorption. There were no seatbelts. Hudson, like all automakers of the 1940s, didn't see the need. When accidents happened, the driver's body became a human projectile, slamming into the wheel, the dash, or the windshield with unrestrained force. Survivors often described being thrown like a rag doll, while crash investigators noted that most front seat passengers died instantly of chest or skull trauma. The brakes, though hydraulically operated, struggled under the Commodore's massive weight. Fade was a common problem on long descents, and even in normal conditions, stopping distances were alarmingly long. Period reviews from Mechanics Illustrated praised the car's ride quality, but warned that braking requires anticipation. Owners learned to begin slowing well before intersections. The car's weight gave it momentum that was almost impossible to arrest once it was moving fast, a trait that made it terrifyingly dangerous in emergencies. A retired highway patrolman from New York recalled, "When a Hudson hit something, it didn't stop. It just kept going through whatever was in front of it." Even the steering could betray drivers. Though smoother and more precise than most of its contemporaries, the Hudson's steering box lacked mechanical collapse or deflection. In a head-on crash, the column didn't bend, it speared. Countless fatal accidents of the era involved drivers being impaled by their own steering shafts, and the Hudson's heavy, low-mounted design made the outcome even worse. The lower seating position meant the driver's torso was almost perfectly aligned with the shaft, turning every collision into a potential impalement. The heavy structure also had an ironic side effect. It protected the car better than the people. Many post-crash photos showed Hudsons that appeared barely dented from frontal collisions, while the interiors told a very different story. Emergency crews who responded to these wrecks often remarked that the victims were killed not by intrusion, but by deceleration, the sheer G-forces transmitted through the unyielding frame. At a time when engineers equated durability with safety, this paradox went largely unnoticed. To buyers, the Hudson's ability to take a hit and keep its shape seemed reassuring. In truth, it was an illusion that cost many lives. Mechanically, the Commodore was a marvel of quiet strength. Its smooth inline-8 engine, displacing up to 254 cubic inches, delivered a dignified surge of power and near-silent operation. It was a car that seemed to float down the road, its suspension soaking up bumps with a grace unmatched by most competitors. Yet this composure could be deceptive. The car's weight, combined with narrow bias-ply tires and modest drum brakes, made handling unpredictable at high speeds. Quick steering corrections could send the massive body lurching or fishtailing, and with little crash protection, even a simple loss of control could prove fatal. Despite these dangers, the Hudson Commodore was adored in its time. It was seen as refined, almost aristocratic, a car for the man who wanted sophistication without ostentation.
It stood apart from Ford and Chevrolet in both design and engineering. The step-down floor pan would later inspire the structure of Hudson Racings in the early 1950s, cars that dominated NASCAR and set speed records. But that same rigid strength that made Hudsons unbeatable on the track was exactly what made them killers on the street. Speed plus mass with no safety features was a recipe for destruction. In the late 1940s, car accidents were often described in newspapers with a kind of resigned fatalism. The car was destroyed and all inside were killed instantly. The Hudson Commodore appeared frequently in those reports, not because it was unreliable, but because it was powerful, fast, and built too solidly for its own good. It was a machine that transmitted the laws of physics directly to human bodies without mercy or mitigation. There was no cushioning, no absorption, only impact.
The 1941-1947 Packard Clipper remains one of the most visually refined and symbolically important American cars of the 1940s. It marked the last great attempt by Packard to modernize before the company's slow decline after the war, and even today, it stands as a strikingly handsome car, elegant, long, and impossibly smooth for its time. Its sleek, teardrop-shaped body, integrated fenders, and low-flowing roofline made it look decades ahead of its contemporaries. To the average observer in 1941, the Clipper must have looked like a glimpse of the future, a true luxury car that seemed to float across the road. But under that modern shape, Packard's engineering philosophy was still mired in the past. The Clipper was, in truth, a dangerous blend of luxury and lethality, a car that looked sophisticated but behaved like a steel juggernaut in an era before safety was even a consideration. When the Packard Clipper debuted in 1941, it was meant to save the brand from the creeping irrelevance that had plagued it since the late 1930s. Its body design, created by Howard Dutch Darren and refined by Packard's in-house team, abandoned the upright, boxy lines of earlier models for a sweeping fastback silhouette. The car's proportions were graceful and balanced, and its aerodynamic efficiency was a marketing triumph. Yet beneath this fresh design, Packard relied on conservative mechanical architecture, including a solid front axle and leaf springs that would soon prove both antiquated and hazardous. At highway speeds, the car's handling was vague and unpredictable. The heavy front end, paired with bias-ply tires and primitive suspension geometry, caused severe understeer during sharp maneuvers. On bumpy or uneven roads, the solid axle could jump or shimmy, jerking the steering wheel violently from the driver's hands. More alarming was the Clipper's steering gear itself. Reports from both owners and independent garages noted that the steering box could develop excessive play or even seize under stress. In an era before power assistance or collapsible mechanisms, this made steering failures sudden and catastrophic. A number of post-war accident reports describe Clippers losing directional control entirely after a tie rod or steering gear component failed. You didn't steer a Clipper, you negotiated with it, and sometimes it didn't keep its end of the bargain. At speeds above 60 miles per hour, the Clipper's weight distribution and suspension design made it feel less like a precision automobile and more like a ship plowing through waves of asphalt, graceful in calm conditions, but completely unmanageable in a storm. Inside, the Clipper embodied everything Packard owners loved about the brand: refinement, craftsmanship, and quiet confidence. Its interior was lined with high-grade fabrics, polished wood-grain finishes, and glimmering chrome accents. The dashboard was an Art Deco masterpiece, wide and symmetrical, with softly rounded corners and elegant instrument bezels. But it was also a death trap in disguise. The entire dashboard was solid steel, and every control knob was either sharp-edged chrome or hard bakelite. The radio faceplate, clock, and ashtray were made of thick metal. In a crash, these ornate details became deadly projectiles, tearing through occupants with brutal efficiency. The steering wheel was enormous, a hard, thin-rimmed circle of bakelite attached to a rigid steel column that pointed straight at the driver's chest. There was no energy absorption, no deflection, and no padding. In frontal collisions, the steering shaft often speared the driver directly. Medical examiners of the time documented countless cases of penetrating thoracic injuries due to steering mechanism intrusion, the grim clinical language of an era that accepted such deaths as fate rather than failure of design. The Clipper's body was rigid and heavy, weighing close to 2 tons in some trims, and it was built to resist deformation, another illusion of safety that proved fatal in real-world crashes. Without crumple zones or collapsible structures, the car transferred all impact forces directly into the passenger cabin. What made matters worse was Packard's use of a semi-unitized frame that, while advanced for rigidity, had no means of dissipating crash energy. In even moderate-speed head-on collisions, the firewall could buckle inward, crushing the lower legs of front seat occupants while the upper body was flung violently forward. Since seatbelts were still decades away, the cabin essentially became a metal box in which every occupant was hurled into steel and glass. The braking system was similarly inadequate for the Clipper's mass. Large hydraulic drums handled stopping duties, but under repeated use, they overheated quickly, and fades set in almost instantly on long descents or during emergency stops. Contemporary tests published in Popular Science noted that stopping distances from 50 miles per hour were longer than expected and varied significantly depending on brake temperature. On rain-slicked roads, that translated to disaster. Owners often recounted how the brakes would pull unevenly, causing the heavy car to veer sideways. Once the rear end began to slide, there was little a driver could do. The Clipper's bulk carried its own momentum, and recovering control was almost impossible. Ironically, Packard marketed the Clipper as a paragon of modern safety and comfort. Advertisements boasted of its aircraft-inspired body strength and streamlined stability. And indeed, it felt stable as long as it wasn't pushed beyond the limits of 1940s road engineering. The sense of solidity that comforted drivers in peacetime was the same rigidity that killed them in accidents. The very features that made the Clipper feel indestructible, its thick steel frame, heavy doors, and reinforced roofline, became lethal when physics turned against it. A high-speed crash in a Clipper often left the car visibly intact, with its exterior panels unbent, while the occupants inside suffered fatal internal injuries from the brutal deceleration forces. It was the cruel paradox of pre-safety luxury. The stronger the car, the deadlier it was. After World War II, when civilian production resumed, Packard continued to build the Clipper largely unchanged, eager to meet the enormous pent-up demand for new cars. But by 1946 and 1947, it was already behind the times, mechanically. Competitors were beginning to experiment with independent front suspension, better brakes, and more balanced weight distribution. Packard, proud of its traditions and reputation for smoothness, clung to its pre-war architecture and paid the price. The car's solid front axle and vague steering were dangerously outdated in the new age of faster highways and heavier traffic. Despite its flaws, the Clipper held a special place in the hearts of those who owned it. It was smooth, stately, and powerful, a car that seemed to glide over rough roads, isolated from the noise and chaos outside. Many families who could afford one considered it the ultimate expression of post-war prosperity. One owner from Pennsylvania once said, "When you drove a Packard, you felt like you were above the world, until you had to stop or swerve, and then it reminded you how heavy it really was." That sentiment perfectly captures the dual nature of the Clipper, elegant serenity masking mechanical peril.
The 1940 to 1949 Buick Super was one of those quintessentially American machines that defined the post-war era's optimism, long, wide, and impossibly confident. It gleamed with chrome and muscle, powered by Buick's signature straight-eight engine and wrapped in voluptuous curves that radiated prosperity. The Super was a car for the man who had made it, who wanted to glide along Main Street in quiet dominance, enjoying a car that promised luxury, reliability, and prestige without the excess of Cadillac or Packard. But beneath all that polish and grandeur lay a car that could be shockingly unforgiving. Like many vehicles of the 1940s, it was built with little understanding of occupant protection, and in the case of the Buick Super, its very strength became its most terrifying weakness. The Buick Super was introduced as a mid-tier model in Buick's lineup, positioned between the smaller Special and the lavish Roadmaster. It shared the same basic platform as its siblings, including Buick's torque tube drive and rigid ladder frame, a setup known for durability, but notorious for poor crash behavior. Its straight-eight engine was massive, long, and heavy, giving the car a front-biased weight distribution that made handling ponderous and unpredictable in emergencies. Buick's engineers prided themselves on smoothness, and they achieved it by isolating the body with soft rubber mounts and designing the suspension for comfort rather than precision. The result was a car that floated beautifully at moderate speeds, but when pushed, especially in a swerve or panic stop, it behaved like a ship suddenly losing rudder control. Drivers described it as graceful but lazy, and that laziness turned deadly when quick reactions were needed. Inside, the Buick Super was a study in pre-safety opulence, beautiful, heavy, and merciless. The dashboard was a slab of thick steel decorated with gleaming chrome and sharp, protruding knobs. The steering wheel was enormous, mounted on a solid steel column with a massive chromed horn hub that looked like jewelry, but acted like a spearhead in a collision. In frontal impacts, that unyielding hub would crush the driver's chest with fatal force. No energy absorption, no padding, just brute mechanical contact between man and machine. Survivors of early post-war Buick crashes often bore horrific injuries, shattered ribs, ruptured lungs, and internal bleeding from blunt trauma inflicted by the steering column. Doctors at the time grimly referred to these wounds as Buick chest. The car's visibility, or rather its lack thereof, compounded the danger. The flowing roofline and small rear window gave the Buick an elegant, aerodynamic profile, but also created vast blind spots. The thick pillars and low seating position limited forward sightlines, particularly around curves or intersections. During the war years and immediately afterward, Buick's focus was on styling and mechanical refinement, not driver awareness. Testers from period magazines often remarked that parking and reversing the Super required faith rather than sight. That blindness wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly on crowded roads, where split-second awareness meant survival. Perhaps the most insidious danger of the Buick Super, however, came from its build quality and mechanical layout. The car's long straight-eight engine and complicated fuel system were prone to leaks, particularly as the vehicles aged. The fuel lines, which ran close to hot exhaust manifolds, could seep gasoline if the fittings loosened, a not uncommon occurrence with the vibration-prone Buick engine. Combined with aging rubber hoses and primitive carburetor seals, this created the perfect conditions for underhood fires. It wasn't unusual for early post-war Supers to suddenly erupt in flames after a collision, or even spontaneously idling after a hot drive. Newspaper archives contain chilling accounts of mysterious Buick fires that consumed cars within minutes, often trapping occupants behind jammed steel doors and sealed windows. The heavy construction that gave the car its sense of security also made escape nearly impossible once flames began to spread. Buick's marketing at the time spoke endlessly of solid comfort and built like a battleship durability. Unfortunately, that description was truer than intended. The Buick's body was so rigid that in a serious crash, it refused to crumple, transferring every ounce of force directly to the passengers. The doors, thick and tightly fitted, often jammed on impact, effectively trapping everyone inside. The windshield, though made of laminated safety glass in later models, could still shatter into razor-edged fragments when struck from the inside. Passengers in rollover accidents found themselves tossed violently through the air, striking metal edges and chrome fixtures that sliced through flesh with surgical precision. Without seatbelts, the heavy interior fittings became blunt weapons in motion. Handling was no better. The steering, unassisted and heavy, demanded muscle and constant correction. On uneven or gravel roads, common in post-war America, the front wheels would tramline and tug violently, sometimes pulling the car off course without warning. The brakes, large hydraulic drums, were adequate when cold, but faded rapidly under repeated use. Descending a hill or attempting to stop suddenly from highway speed was a heart-stopping experience. Drivers learned to pump the brakes to maintain pressure, but once fade set in, stopping distances stretched into hundreds of feet. Buick's engineers had prioritized smoothness over responsiveness, and the result was a car that felt serene until serenity gave way to panic. One owner from Illinois, interviewed decades later, recalled that the car was beautiful, no doubt. You could take your family to church in it and feel like a king. But when I hit a deer on a back road, the steering wheel crushed my ribs and the car caught fire. I got out, but my passenger didn't. His story echoed countless others from an era when survival often depended on luck rather than design. Buick's reputation for quality survived the decade, but many of its cars did not, and neither did many of their drivers. Still, the Buick Super was admired for its quiet power and sense of dignity. Its Fireball straight-eight engine was smooth as silk, and the Dynaflash carburation made it feel faster than it really was. On a long highway, it cruised effortlessly, and the plush interior made it one of the most comfortable rides of its time. Owners loved the feeling of indestructibility, the idea that they were piloting something substantial, something that built to last. Sadly, that illusion of invincibility was exactly what made it so dangerous. The very steel that gave comfort in peacetime turned merciless in crisis.
The 1940 to 1948 Studebaker Champion was a car that seemed to capture the essence of affordable American optimism during the tumultuous years before and after World War II. It was small, light, and undeniably stylish, with its clean aerodynamic lines, rounded fenders, and distinctive front grille that made it look modern even as it rolled off the assembly line alongside much heavier, more conservative competitors. For middle-class families, it represented the promise of efficiency and economy without sacrificing charm. A car that could carry a family across the country without bankrupting them. But for all its visual appeal and practicality, the Champion was a car built in an era that didn't understand safety, and in many ways, it was a death trap waiting for the unsuspecting driver. Studebaker built the Champion to be affordable, lightweight, and economical. Its curb weight was remarkably low, often around 2,400 pounds, and it used small, efficient engines, the 170 cubic inch inline-six being the most common, to achieve respectable gas mileage. This lightness made the car sprightly and fun to drive on smooth city streets, but it came at a terrible cost when it came to protection in a collision. The body was thin, almost fragile, and there were no reinforcements in the doors or pillars to absorb side impacts. Crash tests decades later revealed just how little the cabin structure could withstand. Even a low-speed side collision could cause catastrophic injuries because the doors had virtually nothing to stop the passenger from being crushed. The Champion's roof, another hallmark of its lightweight design, was thin and undersupported. While the sleek lines and fastback styling made the car look sophisticated, the roof could collapse entirely in a rollover. There are documented cases from the late 1940s in which the Champion's cabin was crushed flat in single-car accidents, leaving no space for passengers to survive. Occupants had no seatbelts, no airbags, and nothing to prevent them from being thrown violently against the steel interior or trapped beneath the collapsing roof. Drivers of the time often remarked on the car's fragility, but in a period when high-speed highways were just becoming common, these weaknesses were deadly. The brakes were another glaring flaw. The Champion used simple drum brakes on all four wheels, but they were underpowered relative to the car's weight and prone to fade after repeated stops. On downhill grades, drivers learned quickly that the brakes could become almost useless, forcing them to rely on engine braking and careful anticipation, techniques that only worked if the road was empty and predictable. On crowded or winding roads, this weakness often led to rear-end collisions or uncontrollable descents. Owners from the era frequently recounted that the car had no stopping power once the drums overheated, adding an element of terror to what would have otherwise been a pleasant drive. Handling, too, was limited. The lightweight chassis, combined with narrow bias-ply tires and a primitive suspension design, made the car twitchy at speed. On sharp turns, the rear end could fishtail, especially when lightly loaded, while the narrow track width made side-to-side stability precarious. Any sudden maneuver to avoid an obstacle or another vehicle could result in a skid or a complete rollover, and with the roof capable of collapsing, the outcome was often fatal. The steering itself was unassisted and somewhat vague, requiring constant attention and strength to maintain control. The interior was minimalist but stylish. Seats were simple, padded just enough to be comfortable but without energy absorption. The dashboard was steel, flat and unyielding, adorned with small chrome knobs and controls that could turn into cutting instruments in a collision. Even minor accidents could result in severe lacerations from dashboard edges or metal trim. Unlike luxury cars, which offered slightly more reinforcement in their cabins, the Champion's emphasis on lightness and affordability left no room for forgiving design. It was efficient, but efficiency in this case meant sacrificing the very thing that could save lives. Fuel safety was another concern. The Champion's fuel lines and engine sealing were rudimentary, and while not as notorious as larger post-war cars prone to fires, leaks could and did occur. In collisions, ruptured fuel lines combined with hot exhaust manifolds posed a serious fire risk. In combination with the collapsible roof and thin doors, this made a serious crash in a Champion a near-certain death sentence in many cases. Despite all these flaws, the Studebaker Champion was beloved for its appearance, affordability, and economy. It became a symbol of post-war pragmatism, the car that young families and returning veterans could rely on to get them from point A to point B without a fortune in gas or maintenance. Its efficient design allowed it to compete with larger and more powerful vehicles in the marketplace, and many owners looked past the risks because it was attainable and stylish. Its modern lines and smooth curves set the stage for the post-war jet-age styling that would define the 1950s. Today, the Studebaker Champion is a favorite among collectors who appreciate its streamlined aesthetics and historical significance. Restored examples gleam at car shows, celebrated for their distinctive front grille and graceful fastback profile. Yet beneath that nostalgic charm lies a harsh reminder of 1940s automotive reality. A car could be clever, practical, and beautiful, and still offer virtually no protection to its occupants. The Champion was efficient, lightweight, and pleasing to the eye, and terrifyingly unforgiving on the road. It was a car of its era, built to be economical in every sense, even at the cost of human lives. In essence, the 1940 to 1948 Studebaker Champion embodies the paradox of early post-war motoring: style, efficiency, and affordability in abundance, but safety, protection, and forgiveness almost entirely absent. It is a vivid example of how cars in the 1940s could inspire pride, delight drivers, and yet quietly harbor lethal dangers behind their streamlined steel bodies.
The Citroen traction Avant, produced from 1934 to 1957, was a car that looked decades ahead of its time. Its front-wheel drive layout, low-slung body, and unitary construction were revolutionary in an era when most vehicles relied on rear-wheel drive and separate ladder frames. The traction Avant literally translates to front-wheel drive, and this engineering choice promised better traction, a lower center of gravity, and more interior space, innovations that influenced European automotive design for decades. On paper, it seemed like a car built for safety, stability, and modernity. In reality, the traction Avant was a car that could be deadly in the hands of anyone unfamiliar with its quirks, and even seasoned drivers often found themselves surprised by its capricious handling. Structurally, the traction Avant was built using monocoque construction, a welded steel body that acted as the entire structural frame of the car. This was revolutionary because it reduced weight and lowered the center of gravity, improving handling and performance compared to the heavy, separate frames of most contemporaries.
Yet the thin steel panels that made this possible offered almost no protection in a crash. Unlike American cars of the same period, which at least had heavy steel to absorb some impact, the traction Avant's body simply crumpled inward. In a collision, the doors could bend, dashboards could collapse, and passengers were left entirely exposed to forces that the car itself could not absorb. Laminated safety glass was not standard in early models, meaning windshields often shattered into dangerous shards, turning the interior into a hazard zone. The traction Avant's handling was a double-edged sword. Its front-wheel drive configuration allowed for impressive agility and cornering speed, but it also made the car unpredictable at high velocities. Sudden steering inputs could break the front wheel's traction, causing understeer that could suddenly flip into a spin if overcorrected. This was particularly treacherous on wet or uneven roads, where the low-slung, narrow tires could easily lose grip. Drivers learned that the car required a delicate touch, accelerate smoothly, brake early, and avoid sudden maneuvers. Misjudge a curve or panic at high speed, and the traction Avant could spin uncontrollably, often without warning. French newspapers of the late 1930s and 1940s include reports of high-speed collisions in which drivers lost control despite careful handling, a testament to the unforgiving nature of the car's engineering. The steering itself, while precise under normal conditions, could amplify danger in emergencies. The front-wheel drive layout concentrated weight over the front axle, which, combined with the independent suspension, could make the steering feel light and overly sensitive at speed. One misjudged input could send the nose digging into a pothole or slick spot, causing the rear end to swing violently. Add to that the lack of modern safety mechanisms, such as collapsible steering columns, and it became clear that a driver's own hands could inadvertently contribute to severe injury in a crash. Inside, the traction Avant was modest but stylish. Upholstery was thin, dashboards were minimalistic steel slabs, and controls were mounted without padding. The interior was designed for efficiency and modernity, not protection. In frontal collisions, the steering wheel and column were unyielding, and passengers had no restraint whatsoever. Even minor impacts could result in broken bones from contact with the metal dash, hard wheel hub, or seat frames. Side collisions were equally dangerous. The thin doors and weak side structures offered virtually no resistance, leaving occupants exposed to intrusions that could crush or lacerate. The braking system, while adequate for city speeds and gentle country driving, was primitive by modern standards. Drum brakes all around were prone to fade under continuous use, especially on long descents or when carrying heavy loads. The car's light weight, while advantageous for acceleration and fuel efficiency, could also exaggerate the effects of braking imbalance or sudden stops. Combine that with its delicate suspension and high-speed instability, and emergency braking maneuvers could quickly turn into catastrophic spins or loss of control. Despite these dangers, the traction Avant was beloved for its innovation and style. It was sleek, aerodynamic, and looked astonishingly modern compared to the boxy cars common in the 1930s and 1940s. French families, professionals, and even police forces adopted it enthusiastically because of its advanced mechanics, smooth ride, and roomy interior. Many drivers appreciated the front-wheel drive for its superior traction in wet conditions or snow, a practical advantage in Europe's narrow, often slippery roads. Yet every advantage came with a hidden price. The very engineering that made the car nimble and efficient also made it unforgiving when mistakes were made. The traction Avant's influence on automotive design is undeniable. Its unitary body, front-wheel drive, and suspension layout paved the way for nearly all European family cars for decades, and its aesthetic elegance remains iconic. But its legacy is a mixed one, a car that inspired admiration and imitation, yet demanded respect and caution in equal measure. Unlike its contemporaries in America, which were massive, heavy, and somewhat protective in a crash, the traction Avant prioritized innovation and style over the hard brute force protection of metal. In practical terms, this meant that drivers and passengers were often left at the mercy of physics rather than engineering. The Citroen traction Avant, in essence, was a revolutionary car that could mesmerize with its beauty and impress with its technology, yet turn suddenly into a lethal weapon on high-speed roads or in unexpected maneuvers. It is remembered today as a masterstroke of design, but also as a cautionary tale that being ahead of your time in engineering does not automatically translate to safety, and that a car's elegance can sometimes mask a deadly propensity for chaos. Its light frame, low stance, and sensitive handling were triumphs of innovation, and the very features that made it terrifying when things went wrong.
The Morris 8 Series E, produced between 1938 and 1948, was the kind of car that epitomized post-war practicality in Britain. Small, affordable, and remarkably accessible to the ordinary citizen at a time when resources were scarce and new cars were hard to come by. Its petite, compact frame and simple mechanical layout made it ideal for narrow streets, village roads, and the emerging post-war highway network. On paper, it seemed perfect, lightweight, economical, and easy to maintain. But the reality of driving a Series E was far more perilous than its cheerful appearance suggested. For all its charm and efficiency, the car was barely a protective shell, leaving drivers and passengers exposed to the unforgiving consequences of any accident. The Series E was designed as a successor to the pre-war Morris 8, with modest updates to styling and mechanicals. Its body was small, narrow, and built from thin steel panels, giving it the lightweight necessary for fuel efficiency and low production costs. Weighing barely over 1,800 pounds, the car could be nimble in town, but the narrow track made it dangerously unstable at higher speeds or on winding roads. On tight corners, the soft suspension, a simple combination of leaf springs and rudimentary shock absorbers, would allow excessive body roll, causing the chassis to sway unpredictably. Experienced drivers often reported that a sharp swerve could easily lift a wheel, break traction, and send the car into a spin, especially on wet or uneven pavement. The steering was another source of danger. Unassisted and mounted close to the driver, the large-diameter wheel could become a lethal obstacle in a collision. In frontal crashes, the driver's chest or head would be thrown directly against the unyielding metal rim and rigid column, often resulting in severe trauma. There were no collapsible columns or padding to absorb impact, and the simple dashboard, a thin steel slab with protruding knobs, offered no forgiveness. Side collisions were equally hazardous. The doors were light and thin, and their latches were prone to failure. In a serious accident, the doors could burst open, sending occupants partially out of the vehicle and dramatically increasing the likelihood of injury or ejection. The brakes on the Morris 8 were basic drum units with limited stopping power. On dry, level roads, they could manage slow city speeds, but on descents or in emergency situations, they were woefully inadequate. Brake fade was common after repeated stops, and uneven road surfaces could exacerbate instability during braking. Drivers quickly learned that they had to anticipate hazards far in advance and rely heavily on engine braking because panic stops often resulted in a loss of control. The Series E's interior offered only minimal comfort and safety. Seats were thinly padded, and there were no seat belts, an omission that was typical for the era, but one with dire consequences in the event of a rollover or collision. The compact cabin meant occupants were seated close together and close to the rigid steering and dashboard elements, leaving little space to absorb impact forces. In rollovers, the car's thin roof offered almost no protection, frequently collapsing under the weight of the vehicle. Crash tests and accident reports from the late 1940s document instances where the Series E's cabin deformed entirely, leaving passengers trapped or crushed. Despite these dangers, the Morris 8 Series E became one of Britain's most popular cars in the post-war period.
Its affordability, low running costs, and straightforward maintenance endeared it to families, small businesses, and rural drivers. Many viewed it as a lifeline, providing reliable transportation in a country still recovering from wartime shortages. Drivers and mechanics praised its simplicity. The engine was easy to service, parts were readily available, and the car consumed little fuel. It was, in many ways, a triumph of practical design, a vehicle that made mobility attainable for ordinary people. Yet the very features that made the SE practical also made it a hazard. Its light frame, narrow track, and minimalistic construction meant that physics was rarely in the occupant's favor. A slight misjudgment at speed could easily turn a minor accident into a catastrophic accident. Owners were often aware of the car's fragility. One rural driver recounted, "It got you where you needed to go, but you learned to drive it like a glass egg." In other words, survival depended on care, anticipation, and a touch of luck, not on engineering. Today, surviving Morris 8 Series E's are appreciated by collectors for their quaint design, small footprint, and historical significance as post-war British workhorses. Their rounded fenders, simple chrome detailing, and cheerful appearance make them an emblem of an era when cars were meant to be functional, not safe. But anyone who studies their construction closely understands the risks they carried. A tinny, unprotected shell offering almost no defense in a crash. The Morris 8 Series E represents a stark reminder of the era before automotive safety became a serious consideration. It was affordable, practical, and endearing, yet also terrifyingly fragile. It illustrates how early post-war cars could give people freedom and mobility while simultaneously exposing them to mortal danger. In the story of the SE, beauty and utility coexist with vulnerability, creating a vehicle that was as much a risk as it was a reward for those who drove it.